That would be great. If you have questions during the presentation, Dr. Balogun-Mwangi is happy to answer them. Please put them in the chat and we'll make sure she gets them. At the end of the presentation, you'll have an opportunity to submit more questions, and you can ask them either by unmuting yourself or typing them in the chat. Dr. Oyenike Balogun-Mwangi is assistant professor in the Salve Regina Department of Psychology and a Macaulay Scholar. Her research and clinical interests focus on mental health disparities, cross-cultural issues in mental health, microaggressions among racial and sexual minorities, and body image among African women. Recent research examined the impact of multiple stigmas among Black adults with serious mental illness in employment contexts, and a mixed method study on body image among African women, which places important attention to non-weight related aspects of body image among the population. Her most recent publications include 2020's What Is It Going to Be Like? A Feminological Investigation of Racial, Gender, and Sexual Microaggressions Among Highly Educated Individuals in the journal Qualitative Psychology, and 2019's Vocational Peer Support, Results of a Qualitative Study in the Journal of Behavioral Health Services and Research. Dr. Balogun-Mwangi completed her doctorate in counseling psychology at Northeastern University, pre-doctoral internship at Harvard Medical School, Massachusetts Mental Health Center, and postdoctoral research training at Boston University Center for Psychiatric Rehabilitation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Balogun-Mwangi as she presents Pretty Like Us, Cross-Cultural Perspectives on Body Image.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. So thank you all for being here. I want to start, first of all, by thanking our phenomenal library staff for coordinating this event and giving faculty space to sort of talk about the things that we nerd off on. And, you know, this is such a joy to have an opportunity to talk about things that I enjoy thinking about. So thank you for organizing me in a semester that's really hard to do that. And I also want to thank all of you for being here. I know it's such a busy time in the semester and also a really difficult week for our community. So I'm mindful of that. And having that in mind, this loss of our family, Devin, I'll actually begin with a moment of silence to remember him, if that's okay. So if we could just take a moment and remember Devin. Okay, thank you, family. All right, so I'm gonna start with a screen share to sort of walk us through some of my thinking here. And, you know, we don't have a long time with each other, so I definitely want to sort of do this sort of spotlight approach to some of the thinking that I've done and currently doing with some students. I think some of them will be on the call today. They haven't shown up yet, will show up and maybe they'll have something to offer at the end during Q&A. But I'll do a screen share and we can begin. Thumbs up if you all are able to see it. All right, thank you. So, you know, I wanted to start really by talking a little bit about my inspiration for the title, because it's very much part of the inspiration comes from a class I've been teaching and some thinking I've been having some of my students engage in abnormal psychology. And I actually encouraged them in the beginning to reflect on excerpts from a book called Crazy Like Us by Ethan Waters. I don't know if people in the room are familiar But this is a book where Ethan Waters argues as part of the central thesis that there's a lot about psychological disorder that is very much born, at least the central understandings of it, in Europe and America, basically in the West. And a lot of these ideas are being sort of exported globally as part of a global understanding to parts of the world where certainly experiences of certain phenomena are not the same and may occlude those understandings. So for example, the chapter I have my students read is about the tsunami that occurred in Sri Lanka a little while ago that decimated most of Sri Lanka, at least a corner of Sri Lanka. It was quite devastating. And he speaks about, he writes about all these volunteers coming in, mainly from UK and the Americas, to support the population, and coming in really expecting to see a certain thing, which was a trauma response, specifically post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. And they were coming in with a checklist and the way to sort of, support the population, and very soon realized that the response of that population was not classic symptoms of PTSD, that for these individuals in Sri Lanka, the way in which they understood the impact of trauma was actually quite social, that you lose social roles and you lose people in your lives, and that sort of changes your relationships with others, that their understanding of what was broken was really social, not necessarily hypervigilance or anxiety or something that's very much in their minds. And Ethan Waters is basically saying, at least in his argument, and I think my students land here too in reading what he's arguing, is that in doing so, in making these sort of broad loops or having these powerful phenomena define certain experiences, that what that does is it occludes what is actually happening in certain contexts globally, right? That we might wipe out certain understandings simply because there's a power source of knowledge that comes from the West that defines the experiences of other people. And I think in the conversation about body image and beauty ideals, especially as it impacts Black African women, I feel that this is a central thread as well, right? That there is tons of messaging about what it means to be desirable, what it means to be attractive, what it means to be beautiful, that Black African women are responding to. While some of it is very much born in the cultures of the individual countries and tribes that they represent, a lot of it is not born of that. It's actually coming from a Eurocentric ideal that African women are trying to approximate. And that sits very much in the central argument that Ethan Waters is talking about. And I hope to sort of land in those spaces and to expand on this thought throughout the presentation. But I wanted to start with positionality. So on my research team, we've been talking a lot about our relationship to the things or the questions that we're trying to answer, right? And especially to the individuals that we are trying to sort of look at and whose experiences that we're trying to understand, and to always be thinking about how we're positioned in relation to that. So I want to sort of model that again, because I know that there are students in the room about, for me as a researcher, the importance of that. Certainly I'm a Black African woman, so there are many sort of research questions that I've answered where I don't necessarily have this closeness and positionality to the subject, but this one I feel that I do, and particularly in the larger study, there's quite a bit of overlap in terms of the phenotypically how the women presented, but also in terms of level of education and class, there was a lot of overlap. So in some ways, I felt very much as an insider in terms of my position to the subject, but I've also now lived, I lived, until I was 24 in Nigeria and Kenya, and then have been in the US since then. So certainly my own sort of perspective on the issue of body image is very much informed by the years that I've spent here. So certainly I have to be aware of the ways in which I feel very much like an insider and sort of grab the inside of the box, but ways in which I'm on the outside of the box as well. And as a research team, we think about this in terms of every question that we're asking. And I think it's important just to be explicit about that. So I wanted to start, first of all, with a discussion. We're going to talk about magazine covers a lot in this presentation, but I wanted to start with this one, which is someone you might recognize, American actress Lupita Nyong'o, who is of Ugandan descent, grew up in South America for part of her life. But famously, was involved in this controversy with this magazine in the UK called Grasra. And she took a cover photo for this magazine. The cover photo that she took was the one on the right in black and white. And then the image that ended up on the cover was the one on the left, the one that looks a little bit colored. Am I the one who's clicking? Is that sound me, or I'm picking up sound, I'm sorry. So I wanted to start here with sort of a chance for you to sort of reflect on what has been altered with Lupita Nyong'o here, right? So Grasra magazine has made some decisions about what they think might be appealing to their readership in terms of what they changed about Lupita Nyong'o. So if you have some thoughts about what's been altered here and what's been changed, or what Grasra magazine is communicating to us about what might be appealing to their readership, what do you notice? Now you can speak to the group, or you can throw it in the chat, like whatever you're comfortable, but what do you notice here?
Her hair has been altered.
Yeah, so her certainly she has her hair pulled back, and that has been photoshopped out to more of a cropped hairstyle to basically remove her textured curls there that you can see in the back. I'm going to look at the chat really quickly. I know people are responding there, so I'm going to try and see what's going on. Hopefully I can pull it up. So I'm seeing they removed her curls. I'm seeing a question, did they make her face bigger? Her lips are more emphasized. They've changed the shape of her lips. Certainly some indication that maybe her nose has been altered. And Chad is saying it reminds him of Shiseido, which I think is is it Japanese or Korean commercial, like a beauty line in the interwar period with Japanese women when they were idealized with white Western features. And Danielle is saying her face is shifted, chin has been moved forward. Lighting, that's a really good one. Lighting to highlight certain aspects of her face, like her cheekbones. And Anne-Marie saying it even looks like her forehead or hairline is different. Any other thoughts?
Okay, this is
Yeah.
Tim. Hi.
Hi, Tim.
Hi. The original looks, her expression looks more thoughtful, a little skeptical, something like there's going on, like she's thinking about something, or she's kind of checking out the photographer. And the newer one looks a little more vacant. Still looking, but she just looks more thoughtful in the original eyes, I guess I would say, to me.
Like maybe there's a thought in there rather than just being sensualized in a sense.
Yeah, it looks a little mannequin-like in the new one. Yeah.
Thank you, Tim. I know what happened to my chat here, but I think there's more coming in. More seductive look. Yeah. And I was trying to find a color picture of the original and couldn't find it, but she seemed to me kind of fresh-faced, not a lot of makeup. And the comment here is that makeup has been added, like her lips have been reddened, her cheekbones have been accentuated, looks like she has blush on, but she looks more made up in that finalized picture and more finished, quote unquote. Right. More glamorous, Carol says. She's been glamorized. So, she famously went quite public, and she tends not to be pretty confrontational, but she got pretty confrontational with this magazine about the changes that were made. And she says she was really excited to have taken this, cover photo for this magazine, and then saw the issue and did not feel like it reflected her person at all, and was sending, she thought, a really strong message about her person, about what she looks like and whether or not it was enough, right? And that sort of started a conversation about especially the idea of Black women on covers of magazines and what it is that the standard is that they're supposed to approximate, or what the messaging is here. And many people would argue that for the most part, you know, she has sort of embodied this, you know, she's sort of been a beacon for girls of color who feel sort of absent, and for her to sort of be faced with a situation like this seemed to be quite troubling to her, and really brought a conversation that I think was very important to the fore. But I think a lot of what has been offered right now in the chat and in discussion, we're going to touch on a little bit, because I think a lot of what you see here is part of the central thread that we noticed when we were asking women questions about how they experience their bodies as Black African women and what they think was the ideal or the messaging about what it is that makes them appealing or attractive. So, you know, one of the ways I sort of come at this, especially when I'm talking to students in class about thinking about questions cross-culturally, is to really try and organize it in some way. And you know, what's helpful to me as I think about body image, especially when I talk about this position that I occupy, which is this, you know, kind of like straddling America and Africa, is really that a lot of how I understand the experience of one is usually colored by another. And the space for that is in cross-cultural psychology we call comparativist methodology, which is having at least two groups that you're looking at, right? And within those two groups, trying to find what is sort of the overlap or the thread that links the two, but also keeping an eye on what is distinct in populations. And I think that body image research, especially like, you know, the kind that, you know, I'm sort of beginning to do with Black African women, really lends itself to this, because there's very little generally in the African space around body image. So to do sort of an within group comparison is quite weak. The base of knowledge that exists there is really thin. So we find ourselves having to do these comparisons to other populations of women around the world to sort of make sense of what we're seeing. So, you know, this particular approach has really been helpful to me. So I hope to do a little bit of that in terms of thinking about some of the things that we're seeing, sort of help in many ways contextualize and start from a known place that I think a lot of us in the room can identify with. Now, the problems with this particular methodology is equivalence, and we face that right away. And what do I mean by equivalence? So in the study that we run, and I'm going to talk about the details in a second, we were trying to find scales that have been validated for Black African women in Africa, and none of those exist, really, not a lot, right, that have been, for the most part, written or developed specifically to ask questions of Black African women. So we're in a position where we're using sort of scales of body image that were developed usually in this part of the world, but have shown some credence or credibility in populations, in populations of African women in Africa. So, for example, we use the eating disorder diagnostic scale, we use the ideal body stereotype scale, and interestingly, the developer of that is Eric Stice, who basically let us change just about every question on it with his permission, but we had to because, you know, we were asking a completely different population of women similar questions and trying to find answers. And then we also use the objectified body consciousness scale, which, as far as I knew at that point, had probably only been used once in a study in Tanzania. So, you know, the question lies, are we actually measuring the same thing? So when I talk about objectification, is that the same in New York as it is in Lagos? Is this the way, and like, is the understanding the same? Are we looking at the same thing? So part of the question is, part of the tension is to be asking the questions about whether or not we're actually looking at a phenomenon that crosses cross-culturally, that lends itself to comparison. So that's some of the tension of this particular approach. But I should also say, interestingly, with the issue of equivalence, we were also using scales that had never been used with our comparative sample, right? So if we're saying that our comparative sample is white women in the US, the skin color satisfaction scale has not been used with this group. There's, not that I think that there's no need for it within the group, but usually that is given to non-white women. So I wanted to say a little bit about sort of my initial inspiration in tackling this particular topic of body image, and it started actually with a historical reading, and that basically blew my mind. I wasn't quite sure why I had never heard this particular story before. And some of you who see this picture might be familiar with the image and the story, but a lot of, at least the general fuel for my initial study came from readings about Sarjay Bartman. You will see her in the literature sometimes as Sarah Bartman, who was a South African woman who lived in the late 1700s to the early 1800s. And she was part of what was called the Khoi tribe in South Africa. There are different names for the tribe, but what was distinct about this particular people was sort of a phenotypic difference in terms of where fat deposits were in their bodies, where particularly the women had sort of larger hips and like large deposits of fat in their buttocks. So they were sort of distinct as a tribe in that way in South Africa. But this particular woman, Sarjay, was actually in Cape Town and was approached by, I believe he was Scottish, a tradesman, William Dunlop, who convinced her to come to Britain with him and be on display as a way of earning money. And it took some convincing, but eventually he did get her to come. And there are records of her in London and in Paris, usually in sort of fairs where she is on display and sort of as entertainment for the viewing public, and would get a cut of the proceeds. Now, she died in Paris. It's not clear to us how she died. But that's not kind of where her story ends. What happened to her body became quite at least for South African, quite a troubling story that also involved Nelson Mandela in the 90s. So her body, the cast of her body and her skeleton, which you see on the right, ended up in the Museum of Man in Paris, side by side, such that she was still kind of on display. And was on display in this way, her skeleton and the cast of her body, until the mid-70s. And then she still remained in the museum, but sort of in back rooms. And when Mandela became president of South Africa, there was ongoing sort of back and forth with the French government about returning her remains to South Africa and not keeping her on display. And the actual return of her remains was contentious, and she was not returned until 2002, South Africa, right? So, why is this important, especially if we're thinking about comparativist methodology? So the idea that we all recognize, and maybe we don't, but I think a fair number of us will sort of be quite familiar with the objectification of women as fairly normative, especially in this particular context. So the gaze on women, especially parts of women, that gaze internalized over time being damaging to women, right? So, and that is pretty much at work here. What you will see, especially in sort of my digger deep in foray into this and exploring this, is that for African women, the gaze is not of their own. So there are ways in which we could argue that the objectification of American women is very much of American society. That the gaze is, we can talk about the gaze of American men on American women. It's of their own, right? But you will see in writings about Black African women that a lot of the time it is colonial voice, actually white male colonial voice, talking about the bodies of Black African women. It's not of their own. It's not even of their own men gazing on them. It's sort of this completely external gaze from a different continent, evaluating their bodies, usually in comparison to a white ideal. So there are ways in which Sarjay was being compared to British women or white women in the UK, and the way in which her body deviated from that was the spectacle that was on display here. So one example, when I bring this home, I was looking at sort of this particular question in Nigeria specifically, and especially in the early writings from the 60s and 70s, towards the end of colonialism, there's a lot of sort of anthropological writing about different tribes in Nigeria. And there's one that I read about the Igbo tribe, which is in the eastern part of Nigeria, where there's a practice of fattening brides before their weddings as part of the culture. So it's sort of a message from her family that she was well taken care of, and a message to her spouse's family that this is the degree of pampering we want you to offer this woman. But this anthropologist basically makes a conclusion, there's all these allowances for large body sizes in Nigeria, and, that's celebrated. And I think in many ways that's accurate, but it's, to me, quite interesting that these are not necessarily, it's not, I see an absence of voices that are Black African themselves saying these things. And actually, in many ways, the experiences of much younger Black African women is in many ways very similar to young women in the US in terms of the ideals that they're trying to approximate. But I did want to point that out as a distinction. And one of the pieces around the time that I was doing this type of reading showed up when there was famine in the Horn of Africa in sort of the early 90s to mid 90s. There were a lot of benefits on this side of the world to raise money for that. But J.E. Fair really writes about how Black African women were depicted in that sort of famine campaign, right? And how their bodies were depicted, how they were talked about, the way in which the problem was posed, which is that they did not give answers. They were really the background to an issue, not central to the issue. Their voices were not necessarily invited. And very much, I don't necessarily want to say that has changed, because I see very much the echoes of that. And J.E. Fair writes something this is a media personality, a journalist, writes this in 1996, and I actually start my dissertation with this quote, where this journalist says, African women are stereotyped as mindless and instinctual, embodying inferior qualities of womanliness compared to their Western counterparts. In their portrayals as instinctual beings, women in Africa rarely are shown as whole women with both intellects and bodies. I start my dissertation here, and I kept this as sort of like a little Post-it note over my workstation as I worked on my dissertation, because I did not want to be guilty of that, and knew very much that I could be, as someone who was writing about often maybe women that reflected my experience or didn't. So I'll say a little bit about the initial study just to kind of give some edges about what we did. So this was primarily an online study where we sent out surveys via an email link, but we also did some in-person recruiting in 2 cities, Nairobi, Kenya, and in Abuja, Nigeria, so fairly large. And we basically were approaching women in beauty salons and in open air markets with iPads for them to fill out the survey. And a lot of our recruitment actually came from that. So it was a mix of, some of the scales that I mentioned earlier, open-ended questions that women could sort of write as much as they wanted in response to. And these were open-ended questions like, how would you describe your hair? What words would you use to describe your body? What words would you use to describe your facial features? And they just had space to write as much as they wanted. So we recruited 230 women, and predominantly they were Kenyan and Nigerian. Ages 18 to 69, although our sample very much sat in the lower end of that, mainly women in their late 20s to mid 30s. And I want you to look at the last 2 bullets here, because I think this is really important in terms of who it is we ended up looking at. So 91% of our sample had at least a bachelor's degree. Half of them had master's degrees, and almost 90% of them were in the top 2 highest quintiles for wealth. And we used a particular metric used to calculate socioeconomic status in low to middle income countries. So we used 5 questions to assess this. And the women in our studies, 90% of them were in the top 2 quintiles. So we were looking at highly educated, middle to upper class women in both countries, which is really very important, especially in sort of thinking and generalizing our findings, right? And then the current study I'm working on right now with a couple of students here at Salve that I hope have been in the call since we started, and it's supported by the work on the Macaulay Faculty Collaborative, is a content analysis of Genevieve magazine, which is one of the highest circulating magazines in Nigeria at the moment. And what we're doing is looking at a magazine that is 14 years old, and basically coding the first 2 years that the magazine has been in existence, a middle-ish 2 years, which is what we're doing right now, and then the most recent issues. And we're coding the models that are on the cover, their skin tone. We're looking at the hair textures. We're looking at what they're wearing. We're looking at body size and body shape, if we're able to assess that. We're looking at, the ways in which they're positioned, so sort of dominant positions, subservient positions, and making notes on a whole range of other issues from these covers as well. So we have some of our own Salve students involved in this particular research, which is pretty exciting. So right now this is ongoing. We've coded already, I believe, an entire year, maybe into a second one. So we're making a little bit of progress here. So I wanted to start, and those of you who are faculty members that were at my presentation for faculty assembly, this was sort of the corner that I was able to have time to sort of present on. So I wanted to start here. So what you're seeing here is a figure rating scale, as usually used as a way to sort of assess, current body size, actual body size, but also body size ideals that women are approximating here. So the top left is the stunt grid, which is one of the oldest ones. And the one on the bottom right was the pulvers, which we used. And the pulvers was redrawn to be a little bit more accessible for women of color, because a lot of these tend to sort of have these aquiline features that were not particularly accessible. So in our study, using the pulvers, and you may remember this from my presentation then, we asked women 2 questions, select the body size that best approximates what you look like today, and then select the body size that you aspire to. So what we found is for our sample, many of the women were sort of between 5 and 4. Our mean was like a 4.5 as their actual body size. And then we calculated if there was a difference between this actual body size that they were endorsing and what they desired. And there was a statistically significant desire to have a relatively smaller body size. And it was about 1 body size smaller. Now, where this overlaps when we're thinking about comparativist methodology is that if you look at a lot of studies that use rating scales in the US, in the UK, in South Korea, you will see general trends with basically the starting point being different, right? So our own sample had a starting point that was probably a little bit larger than women in this context might endorse. And women in this context have a starting point a little bit larger than South Korean women might endorse, right? But women here in the US want or desire to be 1.5 to 2, sometimes depending on the sample, even 3 body size smaller, and South Korean women even have a larger discrepancy. So a smaller starting point, but really wanting to be 3, 4 body sizes smaller. So there's definitely overlap here, which is that it looks like when we're looking at Black African women, there's definitely a desire or an idealization of a smaller body size relative in relative comparisons to others. So I want to stop here and just check in and see if there are any questions that I can address before I continue. All right, I'm going to take it as permission to proceed. So in terms of this argument that I made that we really did not want to give women a bunch of scales, especially scales that we were not particularly confident in terms of whether or not it was looking at, you know, some of the constructs that we were interested in seeing it without doing some sort of qualitative, open-ended response format where our the women in our sample could sort of give us some responses. So, you know, I picked some of the quotes that I thought really captured a lot of the themes that we ended up coding when we looked at the open-ended responses. So we had 230 women in the quantitative study, but 77 women in the qualitative. So it was a really long survey and we had a lot of fatigue and not many women made it to the end where we had the open-ended questions. So 77 is still a fairly large number for a qualitative study, so we feel pretty confident. But here is one quote from a young 30-year-old woman in Kenya, where she says, "I put on weight, people think I am too big. I lose weight, others think I am too thin. People will never be satisfied." And this is a really important quote because one of the comparative distinctions that we found was that even though there is this sort of socio-culturally oppressive milieu that we, at least I would say a lot of people in this room probably recognize really well, which is that there's always this messaging about bodies and there's never really, like, perfection is elusive, right? What is the body? What is the, so there's always this feeling that we don't quite measure up. What we found among our sample is that, and this is certainly true of my experience, is that, and this differed from country to country, more in Nigeria in this case than Kenya, was more explicit statements from peers and family when there's change in body size, right? So here, you know, I actually would tell my peers, I actually felt, you know, I feel really comfortable here because even if there's any sort of weight gain, nobody says anything about weight gain. You might hear something about weight loss, right? And that's problematic too. You might hear, but people are really silent around, you know, around weight gain. And that is not necessarily my experience in Nigeria. People are very explicit. It's part of the greeting that you've gained weight. So, you know, it was overt and relentless in a way that, you know, I feel maybe is not part of the milieu here. So that came out in our studies of women there. But to my point about having to be informed because of the weak base of studies among Black African women, a lot of our studies were really informed by studies of African American women here in the US and what was found that was distinct about their experiences of their bodies and what body dissatisfaction looks for this particular community. And this picture is actually from an NPR article that was looking at the experiences of African American women dating. And OkCupid has all this data that it crunches, and this particular article was discussing this phenomenon where really, if you're looking at desirability and ranking that African American women objectively fall at the bottom in terms of, you know, the kinds of responses they get when they reach out to men or to partners of interest, and whether or not they get a positive response back. And the numbers with OkCupid are quite clear. It doesn't matter who African American women are reaching out to, they tend to get less response. And, you know, when interviewing African American women, a lot of the overlap that we found that informed our study among Black African women did show up, right? Which is that there is concern mainly about non-weight related aspects of appearance. So, you know, mainly hair texture, skin color lightness or darkness, and facial features like nose and lip size would often come up. And those tend to be more salient measurements of body image satisfaction among African American women than weight. Not that weight is not part of the mix, but it's less of a mix and not central. And when it is that any aspect of the body just show up, it's actually more around body shape. So how small is your waist? what are the size of your breasts or your butt? Like that shows up more than thinness as being sort of the driver of body image satisfaction or the lack of it. So having this type of information from the get in terms of reading what is happening in populations of Black women here in the US and even in the Caribbean and in the UK really informed the types of questions we were asking Black African women. And we're glad that we did, because those were the aspects that did rise to the top. So for example, this quote here about hair texture, a 39-year-old woman from Kenya says, "My hair is an asset." And I want to stop there and say, overwhelmingly, there was a lot of positive messaging about all aspects of the body. So I don't want to sort of lean negative here, because a lot of what we saw was sort of celebratory messaging around how good our sample of women felt about how they looked, their hair, their bodies, their facial features. There was overwhelming satisfaction, right? And this one sort of captures, at least in terms of our findings about hair, it catches a lot of the pieces in one quote, which is why it's here. And this respondent says, "My hair is an asset, thick and voluminous, a bit too gray for my own liking given my age, relaxed, though I'd like to go back to natural. I'll go back to natural at some point." So the pieces here that I do want to point out is that we did get a lot of comments about the health of hair. So its thickness, it's how lustrous it was, and there was dissatisfaction if women were perceiving their hair to be thin and unhealthy or breaking. So there was a segment or themes around that. And then there were themes around age. So if hair was graying or not, that came up in terms of, how age might intersect with those relationships with their hair, that came up. And then the last was probably the most interesting, most evolving aspect of our research, and in terms of seeing what Black African women were saying about their hair. So this person is saying that their hair is relaxed. So some people in the room might be familiar with that or not, but when that term is used, it means that there have been chemicals added to the hair to straighten its texture. So a relaxer, she's saying that she's using a relaxer to straighten out her curls so that her hair is straighter, but she would like to go back to natural. And natural in this case being really not in any way altering the natural texture curl pattern of her hair, and basically accepting it the way it currently sits. And there was a lot of aspirational statements in our study about Black African women really wanting to go back to their natural hair textures. And we found that it was very generational. And I see that even in my own family. So my mom very much, was in high school at the time that colonialism ended in Nigeria, and very much feels like straight hair is more palatable for work and professional settings. Less so with this movement, that the fact that my mom's narrative has changed says to me that there's actually a huge shift, where now there's a lot of this natural hair movement, which I think very much has snowballed from a natural hair movement here in the US, and the access to all this YouTube messaging around it that is moving Nigerian women towards an acceptance of their natural hair, which really was not the case, I would say, even a decade ago. So that was particularly interesting to find. So the other pit we land on is commercials and how that fits into what it is that's the messaging to women about what they lack and what they should get, right? And that is not unique to Black African women, right? That things are being sold. We watched a short video in my abnormal psych class today, which was a Dove campaign video that showed the photoshopping that sort of occurs between when a picture is taken and when it ends up on a billboard. And really, the starting photo and the ending picture look nothing like each other, right? But I think the underpinning of this type of these types of ads is basically to create this deficit psychology, which is you're not enough fresh-faced, you need some foundation, you need some mascara. So there's the underpinning of sort of commercialization that basically drives the buying. And hair products, and cosmetics are just billions and billions of dollars in the African market, right? So in writing up this topic, we landed on this particular concept of commodity racism, which is the way in which this type of commercial enterprise shows up for Black African women. What is the deficit that's being sold to Black African women that may be different from the deficit that we're being sold in this particular context, right? So on the left, there is a sort of an old commercial of Peer soap, which is still sold in Nigeria. I use it, can smell it now as I talk about it. And in this old commercial, you can see a little white boy giving a little black boy a bath. And after they use the Peer soap, little black boy is now a white boy and happy, right? Now we can say, oh, that's an old Pierce commercial, but I found this one on the right last week selling this product called Upgrade Body that lightens skin. So you can see that the model on the left is sad, she's dark skinned, model of the right is smiling, she's lighter skinned, and this particular product is selling her lighter skin. And I could buy that last week for $4.31. Okay. So blatant advertising for skin lightening is everywhere in most countries in Africa and very much normative in Nigeria. And this is central to my thesis about why this is a public health concern for Black African women. Now, when we talk about photoshopping, especially here in the US, we're talking about smoothing out the body, thinning out the body. In this case, she's sort of tanned a little bit more and her sort of facial features have been changed. This is very much kind of, standard fare when we look at this particular context. But in our coding with, the 5 students I've been working with, we've been finding this really interesting phenomenon on the covers of Genevieve magazine, which we've been coding. And I want to kind of talk to you about that. So I hope you can see my little pointer here, all of you, but I'm pointing at the top left-hand photo of a Nigerian artist called Burna Boy, who is here on the left. And what we find is, at least what I found in my perusal, is that when men are depicted on the cover of Genevieve magazine, they really are quite saturated in their coloring. So you can really tell how dark or how light it's very clear to me his skin tone and skin coloring in this particular photo, right? I want you to draw your attention to this one on the right, which is Diola Sagoe. She's a designer in Nigeria. It's just an exceptional, she just makes the most beautiful clothes. But this is Diola Sagoe, okay? And I'm pointing to her right here. But this is also Diola Sagoe in this bottom left. This is her, right? So we were finding, as we were trying to code women on the cover of Genevieve magazine, this beiging effect, where there's sort of this washing out of their coloring, where we can't really tell what the saturation of their skin tone is. Like, she just looks beige. And it's such a finding that I don't see us writing up anything that does not talk about this phenomenon, because I think it's important, right? I think it's important, especially when we're looking at gender trends that show that women are lightened in this way, but men get to be the color that they are. I find that quite troubling. And I'm having a really hard time with it already. But complexion and colorism, at least Africans' form of colorism, because it's really important to me that we don't conflate the two things. When we talk about colorism here in the US, we're talking about a system of privileging of skin color that basically has its roots in enslavement, right? But when we're talking about colorism in Black Africa, we're really talking about one that really has its roots in colonialism. And even though there might be some crossbreeding right now, I don't think that they're quite the same or have the same roots. But here is a 30-year-old woman from Kenya talking about her skin color. She says, I am pretty dark complexioned, more like Lupita Nyong'o. Lupita shows up again, and Lupita comes up quite a bit. So does Beyonce and a whole bunch of other people in reference to how African women were looking at themselves. People think I am too dark, and I have experienced a fair share of discrimination because of it. Right? So colorism, as it shows up in both Kenya and Nigeria, was quite an area of torment for women, especially women who sort of experienced themselves as being darker skinned. And really that a lot of privilege came with being lighter skinned. that in itself was more desirable. So one thing I do want to point out is that we did see, even in our quantitative study, overwhelming satisfaction, right? With all aspects of body image, skin color, color darkness, body shape, body size. Although there were some findings that made us wonder if, there's sort of this Black beauty movement that's going on. I should be proud of how I look, and that the responses, that maybe more accurate responses, were kind of dissonant for the women, right? Because even though we would ask questions about, how satisfied they were with aspects of their bodies, and we got a lot of hurrahs when we asked questions like, how many of you actually use skin bleaching products? That number didn't quite overlap with the satisfaction numbers. So it tells us that maybe there's something that's mediating or moderating that response that we need to look at. But I wanted to end with a brief trailer of a really wonderful documentary that was done by a filmmaker called Beverly Naya, who is Nigerian. I believe she lives in the UK. And I think this one I'm pretty sure is on Netflix, the whole thing. And it's called Skin, and it's highly recommended, but it really does look at this particular problem of colorism in Nigeria specifically, but really thinking about it as a public health concern. Right now, World Health Organization has found that about 40% of African women and men endorse using skin lightening products. And because these products are mercury-based and really do cause really long-standing damage to the skin and have really some pretty serious reverberating effects, that Beverly Naya and her approach to this is quite important in addressing what we think is a public health concern that's born of dissatisfaction, but really is manifesting in ways that are quite dangerous. So I'm gonna have us watch this. I'm gonna check that I've given you guys sound first, and then I will share the video. It's very short, and then open up for questions. This was happening in my class earlier. I'm gonna fire it up again. See if it works this time.
Black beauty is strength.
The human skin, now that's the body's largest organ. It's probably the most important bit of what makes us who we are.
It's organic, it's rich, it's powerful.
I want to audition for the lead, and they go, but the lead's written as black. And I was like, yeah.
I like light skin because it's making me more prettier.
Growing up, I wanted to be every shade other than the shade that I am. I would wear makeup that would make me look lighter. I would use steroids, and what it did, it faded your skin.
Bobrisky is now rich, like I have money because I sell cream, and I make more money from my cream business because I sell the cream all over the world.
At the point where I was bleaching my skin, I struggled so bad with accepting who I was. I felt like I was just, I don't know, in somebody else's body.
She says she's dating someone, and that person likes fair person.
The complexion doesn't make you a better person at all. Complexion has nothing to do with beauty. The world will love you for who you are, not your complexion.
When you use bleaching cream, give you dark knuckles.
Without enough knowledge or not taking enough precautions while using those products, there has been grave damage that's occurred on the skins.
My black is bold, your black is beautiful. My black is intelligent, your black is exciting. My black is black.
If I can change one thing about myself, is going back to my complexion. Do you know why? Because the stress I use in rubbing my cream every day is terrible.
Would you ever go back to black?
If you have the opportunity.
Yeah, I will.
We can improve those skins, bring them closer to what they originally used to be. Unfortunately, there are cases whereby there's irreversible damage and they will need to learn to live with that.
You don't have enough Black people defining or making books and saying, this is who we are.
Because color black is actually strong. It's not something that you can throw away.
You don't have to be, beautiful because the way you are is just the way you behave and the way you are loved.
When you see a human being and the person is black, you notice the complexion, the richness of that complexion. That's Black beauty. For anything else, you notice the skin. You cannot forget the skin.
So I find that voices like Beverly Naya's are really important for young Nigerian girls, especially because this is, I think, one in which we need quite a bit of energy to start to hit. I see how much this is proliferating, and I know we need quite a bit of work. So Beverly Naya's work starts at the level of young girls, if you saw in those groups that she's in. But certainly it's very much a concern at this point. Yeah, so that's what I have. And I'm certainly happy to answer any questions that you may have. I want to see if any of my students are here who might join in. They said they might come in for a little bit. I don't see them. But certainly happy to talk about any aspect of what's been covered.
Nike, while people are thinking about putting their questions out, I was very interested in all of the questions you asked about body image and hair and skin tone, and I was wondering if what your findings were with the other aspects, like like you said, like features, facial features, and so forth.
Yeah, so we used this scale called the Racialized Body Image Questionnaire, which basically asked women to sort of rank the level of satisfaction that they had with specific aspects of their facial features. So lips, nose, eyes, cheeks, like it gets pretty granular in its approach. And, I'm sort of happy to say, and this is links to the observation I made earlier, that there's sort of overwhelmingly like just evidence of high levels of appreciation for those aspects. Where I think we need to do a little bit of digging down is where it seems to me that what we find out on the scales really contradicts what comes up in open-ended questions, or that certain responses tend to contradict others in different scales. So we're not seeing consistency depending on how the question was asked. And then we used a particular scale that gave respondents the option of not applicable, which is kind of like an escape route sometimes, and in the questions that we thought were particularly important. Sort of like nose size and lip size, many women took the not applicable route. So we didn't have a heavy response rate in those questions. So if I were to do it again, we wouldn't necessarily provide that out and see what would happen. So I'm not clear. My hypothesis is that there's a lot more dissatisfaction than we found.
Thank you.
Emily, is your hand up?
Yeah, I have this was really interesting. Thank you so much. The question, well, I have a lot of questions, but the one I wanted to ask is, how come you think that the sample size in your dissertation, not the sample size, but the constituents were all from that kind of upper echelon of the society?
Yeah, I actually think it was a function of our research design, right? Because our questions were written in English, right? It was sent, we were using our networks who could forward it to their networks via email, right? So already you're talking about certainly a cross-section of of any city that has access to a computer, can answer those questions in English. So I think already our research design kind of stacked for this particular group that emerged. And certainly, that's a function of our own facility with language. Like if it was up to me, I would have translated the entire survey to at least Kiswahili, which is actually spoken fairly widely in Kenya, but that would be a problem in Nigeria because there isn't like a second language that's widely spoken that would have us maybe access individuals who were not necessarily formally educated. And I think if we're going to get women across class, we would have to basically do home visits and do verbal interviews in the languages of facility. And we just did not have the resources to do that. So I think the research design really stacked for where we ended up.
Thank you. Yun has a question.
Yes.
Who? I'm sorry, I did. Oh, hi, Hirjan.
First time using the raise hand function. It really has the hand icons. Awesome. Okay, I really enjoyed your presentation. Growing up in South Korea, I always had this type of internal stigmatization and felt external stigma as well. And it's so nice because my dissertation topic was also about stigmatization, but under the topic of sexually transmitted diseases and how to promote HPV vaccination regarding that perception. So my question is, your interview study had the sample of very highly educated female respondents, and I want to know why you focused on that recruitment, and also all of your quotes from those in-depth interviews had perceptions of external stigma, how society views them, but what about the side of themselves viewing themselves? So more internalized stigma, was there any of them?
So I'll address the first question, which really was how we ended up with the sample that we did and if we intended it. And if I'm being honest, I didn't know what I was going to get, and I honestly did not expect that was where we were going to land. Like I think in terms of addressing sort of the need to sort of be a little bit more heterogeneous in terms of class, right? And in terms of educational level, we thought that the in-person recruitment in like beauty salons and in open air markets in Abuja and Nairobi would diversify that. But I don't know, we had research assistants. I did not do that myself. There was one person in Abuja doing the work and one person in Nairobi doing the work. And I really, it's, who they approached, who was comfortable with an iPad, like all of that, I think we need to be thinking about. So it really was not intentional, but once we got our final sample, it was pretty clear that obviously was where we're gonna land given our design. So certainly the challenges and constraints are very much the same as when I responded to Emily, which is that for us to do better and to expand a little bit, we might have to go the school route, which is to go minor, right? Because there's a little bit more heterogeneity in younger girls, but that would be a nightmare in terms of, getting parental permission. So we thought about that, but I do not have the lift for that right now. But certainly I think that's one limitation of our findings, that it really, when we're looking at it even across Kenya and Nigeria, is really quite a homogenous group that way. And then in talking about that, I want to make sure that I hear your second question again, because if I'm being honest, I forgot some of it. So tell me.
It's okay. So all the quotations that you showed me depicted the external stigmatization, how other people view them. But I also want to know if there was any respondents who felt internal stigmatization, how they view themselves.
That's a really good question. So a lot of our responses were actually quite descriptive. So what words would you use to describe your hair? Like most women would give us descriptions, it is usually evaluative descriptions. I love my hair. In fact, we would get 2 words or something like that, or 3 words saying, I love my body, I think I'm hot, I'm the bomb, whatever, right? It was mainly evaluative statements, but sometimes we'd get purely descriptive statements. You know, I have a really small nose, I have eyes that are close together, I would like longer lashes, so very descriptive. So it might be that my bias was selecting these commentary type questions, but actually, you know, I would be honest, a lot of them were very descriptive, except when we did have a final question that asked them what they heard from others about their appearance. That was the last question. And I think a lot of, at least the last two quotes came from that one. But the other questions were really very descriptive in terms of what they said.
Thank you so much.
I think we have a comment from Art Frankel, a question from Chad Raymond, and then a question from Donna Harrington-Luker. And if Art, if you wanted to unmute to say what you were.
Yeah, I did a study with an undergraduate 8 or 9 years ago. We may have talked about this, Oyenike, I forget, a while back. And we were looking at sort of body shapes. This is Shannon Gunnup, who graduated, I think, in 2014. And she found that a few interesting things, one of which was that Salve undergraduate women were not particularly happy with their sort of body shapes, and thought that other people, particularly other women, would not think that they had a good body shape, even when they did have the ideal body shape according to the sample of women we had in that study. We also found, and this is, I'm not sure this is directly related to what you did, but we also found that men who participated in the study thought that women wanted romantic partners, male romantic partners who were more muscular than they thought they were, and women thought that heterosexual women thought that men wanted women who were thinner than the men indicated they actually wanted. So I don't want to say that the misconceptions are the same on both sides, far from it, but yeah, there are misconceptions about what people think of us. And of course, it's most unfortunate that, particularly with women, that they're not particularly satisfied with how they look in one way or another.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's a beast to flip this one on its head and maybe look at the experiences of Black African men. You know, but you know, I already think that the literature is quite weak on women. I'm going to spend my time on that, but certainly I know that the literature on this side says that they're derived from muscularity, and really that the internalized messages that men have look sort of different, and the motivations are different. And I'm pretty sure that that would carry over to the Black African context as well. Thanks, Art.
Chad, would you like to unmute yourself?
Actually, I'm happy to just have the chat message read by Oyenike and responded to. As a spouse of an African woman, I've learned that it's often best to just shut up. So.
All right, let me read your two questions. Do perceptions, oh, I lost it. 1 second. Do perceptions of beauty among different African immigrant groups in the USA change in different ways after time in the USA? And the second question, do African societies that were colonized by different European powers show differences in how female beauty is idealized? Both really fantastic questions. So this is the problem with the first question, is that typically when there are studies of Black populations of women in the US, Black African women are sort of folded in as Black, as one sort of monolithic Black, and those populations are not usually disaggregated. So it's just an impossible question to answer unless there's a study that actually just prioritizes Black African women who have come here for so many number of years, would have looked at, you know, a baseline assessment of them and then made a comparative assessment. And I know of no such study to this point, right? But certainly, you know, if I'm talking about lived experience, I would say absolutely yes. You know, I don't see any way that wouldn't happen. The milieus are in many ways the same, but in many ways very different. And then your second question, yes, and there's a reason why I'm really careful about saying Black African women, right? I know you speak about your spouse who is North African, and the studies that focus on women who are Egyptian or Algerian, there's a separation because Black African women and women in North Africa really phenotypically look very different, and are in many ways are evaluated and have different findings and identify differently. Like most, you know, I read a study that says that Egyptians who come to the US identify as white. Many of them identify as white when the button is offered, right? So that the importance of disaggregating the Black African women from North African women is intentional here, and you will see that disaggregation in most of the body image studies that look at the subject. But certainly to your question about colonialism, you will see, I'll basically do the comparison. So if you look at the milieu of Francophone countries versus countries that were colonized by the British, there are, I would say, some distinctions, right? There is a way in which, especially, you know, countries that really were quite late in gaining independence, the way in which the French colonized was very much to say, you are French. And people who are more familiar with the culture can chime in here. You are French and you are a French citizen and you are French culture and you're gonna speak our language. And in many ways that internalizes sort of being, you know, in many ways approximating Europe psychologically, if not phenotypically, but also within those metrics, the Belgians and the French were in many ways guilty of inculcating a class system based on phenotype in a way that the British did not. So lighter skinned, especially the Belgians, for looking at Central Africa specifically, if you were lighter, if you had more aquiline features, then you were a higher class and you had access to different things than people who presented as sort of phenotypically, you know, Black African, right? In fact, many people would argue that the Rwandan genocide occurred along those lines for that reason. The Tutsis phenotypically got a ton of advantage from the Rwanda, well, it wasn't Rwanda time, but from the colonial Belgian government for looking sort of aquiline in their phenotype versus the Hutus, and that bred a ton of animosity between the two tribes that led to that genocide. So yes, I would say, you know, just from my readings that there seems to be some distinction and some differences based on who colonized whom.
There's a question from Sarah Engel in the chat.
Sarah, all right. Did you find that there were discrepancies between generations and their relationships with their bodies? I know you commented on it previously in reference to your mom. So what did we find in the study? Really good question, Sarah. So here's the thing. We were leaning really young, well, relative to our sample, really young in terms of our numbers. So when we're looking at the women who populated like my mom's age in the 60s and 70s, it was not enough power to do a comparison, right? So even though we had this wide range, the majority of our women in our sample were really in their 20s and 30s. And then we had a smattering comparing to that. It was such a, like, it would be like comparing 200 people to 10. So we did not have enough power to do a comparison and look at it that way. But at least as we could see in sort of the qualitative responses, the only difference that I can probably pull out was less of that, oh, I'm blanking on the word, but less denigration of the body. Like, you know, usually when you read in the body image literature, when there's objectification or people are internalizing certain messages, they tend to really focus on certain body parts. So when internalization occurs and you think that, well, my hips should look a certain way, then there's a focus on the hips. And we start seeing kind of a focus on parts. When women are like, oh, I love my body, and it's sort of global, then that's less of an indication of it, right? So we saw less of that sort of focusing on parts from older women and more of a focus on that with younger women. And then of course, the graying with hair came up with our older sample in terms of concerns around age, but that's really the only distinction that I can see. We did not have enough power really to do a lot of our statistical analysis or comparisons that way. Good question.
Thank you.
And Robin is asking, is Beverly Naya's work part of a larger campaign to educate young people about the dangers of skin lightening? Yes, yes. And so she is an actress, and you will see, you know, if you watch the entire documentary, a lot of it is educational, but I've seen that translate to a lot of the side things that she's been doing in schools and a campaign on talk shows, morning talk shows, which are, you know, highly watched in the Nigerian market to really push back against the dangers of skin lightening. What I haven't seen, I think this is a really good space for cancels culture. Let's cancel some of these particular products. I see less of that and more really trying to inculcate sort of Black pride. Do I think that that's going to work? I think Black pride has very much been the underpinning of trying to bring about high levels of self-esteem, even here in the US. And there is some question about how effective it is when you're living in an oppressive milieu. Like just hearing that my Black is beautiful is important, yes, but if there's all sorts of invalidation that happens, the other 23 hours of the day, it doesn't quite work. And I think that that might be what Beverly Naya faces if the only focus is on inculcating Black pride, which you will see as the theme in that short video, is my Black is beautiful. And I think that's important, but we actually have to do something more. Donna, did you have a question? I see here that you may.
I remember to unmute. No, I had a question that was related to your answer that you gave to Chad, so I'm good. I found it absolutely fascinating. Yeah.
I'm glad. Thank you.
Well, we had lots of nice comments from people.
Yes, I see them. Thank you.
And if anybody has anything else that they would like to ask, please feel free to unmute.
I have a question. Thank you. It's so nice to hear your like whole picture instead of just little snippets in the hallway. I imagine, and maybe this is not an accurate assumption, that it might be draining to be reading about and hearing about these stories, particularly when it's coming from young girls. And I'm wondering how you and your research assistants kind of sit with that and work through that and, you know, grapple with it.
You know, my answer to that is yes, it can be heavy. I think it was heavier to try and pump out a dissertation, which is quite academic, while reading stuff that very much resonates personally. Like, I think I felt a little bit more of that drainage and tension at that point because of the time commitment. What I think we're experiencing, I don't want to speak for, you know, the young women who are working with me on this, but, you know, what we are basically feeling is a lot of just what is it that we're going to find, right? Like I was very, I was quite fascinated with similar studies that look at, hundreds of magazines in South America or here in the US, sort of looking at ideals and landing on some themes and just kind of carte blanche, not knowing what it is that we're going to find. Like the curiosity is really fueling us, like that finding about the Beijing effect. Like that, we landed on that after like wrestling with how to code for a while. And we're like, why this is not working is because they're all beige. So we cannot match them to anything that's a natural human color, at least that would exist among Black African women. It's not us, right? So those types of discoveries are quite exciting for us. Like it's like, oh, here's an answer. And here's the thing that we might be able to point back. Betty Irabo is a person who created the magazine, and she was really helpful to us. Like she had her team actually send us, like images, cover images to start us off that were not available. So I know that we're going to be able to talk to her about what we're finding, and maybe it will land somewhere that's important. But I think right now it's pure fuel and no drainage yet. But yeah, thanks, Katie.
Well, if anybody has anything else to say, feel free to interrupt me. But I would like to really deeply thank Dr. Balogun-Mwangi for presenting this very enlightening research. And I also would like to invite everybody to also consider attending our next few events. The Inclusive Reading Club is on March 18th from 4 to 5, Stop Telling Women How to Smile. And there's another event, Arts for Social Action. It's more than just a 1-credit course in which students will be talking about their experiences exploring the Black Lives Matter movement in Dance 310. So I'm just putting in the chat, oh, thank you, Gretchen already did, our registration link for all of these events. So thank you all for your attendance, and especially to Dr. Balogun-Mwangi.
Thank you, everybody. It was fun. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.